Oh, you are? Okay. They might have deleted... Tom? They might have deleted your presentations. Maybe I should take your stick again. Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, thanks, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. And I'm going to begin by thanking all of the speakers and moderators who agreed to participate. It's an incredible lineup for this conference, and I think it's going to be an exciting day of talks. And thanks also to Gavin Browning and Paul Dallas, who are the masterminds behind events at the school, and so they're responsible for anything good that might happen here today. And thanks as well to Dean Wigley for supporting this event, and to the Universidad de Navarra, which is the co-sponsor and collaborator for the conference. I'm going to be brief. As all the speakers know, we have an absurdly, ridiculously tight schedule in which we have forced you to speak for only 15 minutes. It was apparently unavoidable. But there's a clock here, so you can time yourselves as you're speaking. And if I start gesturing wildly, it probably means that you're well past the 15-minute limit, and so I apologize in advance for the indignity of my gesture. And I think there will be a reception after the conference, and then for the speakers' dinner, and we'll talk about that later. So this conference is ostensibly focused on architectural exhibitions, which is an extremely welcome topic for those of us who have some involvement with exhibitions or exhibition histories, and for the CCCP program here at the school. But as there have been several excellent symposia on exhibitions recently, we decided to cut across the issue with a particular archival scalpel, as it were, to reveal a strange contradiction. A persistent claim made in contemporary curatorial literature and exhibitions research is that the most profound, influential, and consequential forms of aesthetic, critical, even spatial production are not artifacts or buildings, but exhibitions. I don't think our role here today is to agree or disagree with this claim. Nonetheless, it is worth noting that we live in a new era of the world exhibition. There is hardly a space on the planet that has not been touched by biennials, art fairs, architectural installations, and pavilions. The 21st century rivals, if not exceeds, the explosion of display culture of the late 19th century. However, the ubiquity of exhibitions is doubled by their peculiar fugitive quality. While exhibitions seem to increase in importance, and while the narrative of their centrality for art and architecture both becomes ever more familiar, emphatic, and discursively concretized, they encounter their own eventual invisibility. Moreover, as Barry Bergdahl reminds us, many of the most celebrated exhibitions were seen by few. Hardly anyone saw the International Style Show, for example. They become important often only through catalogs, which are generally produced before the exhibitions are installed, or through reviews, or through mythologization. The exhibition terrain is one of disappearance then, fading records, incomplete or non-existent archives, as well as relics, remains, and residue. But this is a problem that's quite familiar to other historians and scholars: how to reconstruct, what documents do we use, what can provide evidence, and how to read it. Yet there's something even more vexing when it comes to exhibitions in this problem. And for example, in Rosalind Krause's astute analysis of the late capitalist museum formed around evacuated industrial spaces and art experiences, while looking at the ethereal glow of a Flavian installation, she claims in this well-known passage, we are having this experience then, not in front of what could be called art, but in the midst of an oddly emptied yet grandiloquent space of which the museum itself, as a building, is somehow the object. Her observation reinscribes the problem of the exhibition within its precise institutional setting, its perceptual effects, its acoustic, environmental apparatus. To continue a discussion we were having just a few days in Istanbul, the exhibition is on one hand a schema of what has been collected together, but on the other also what holds it apart. And what intervenes in this holding apart or spacing or separating is architecture and the exhibition itself. And so what documents this? How can it be documented? This is no small question if exhibitions are indeed the most important form of production of the 20th century. But documentary remains. At least the discussion today will not end with exhibition documents, where we find records, traces, and how we read them, or with the exhibition as document, but hopefully it will prompt us to also inquire into what the status of documents is now, to ask what a document is for an exhibition, and what this allows us to glimpse about the fate of documents in general. I'm going to invite Mark Wigley up to introduce the first round of speakers. Thank you.
So quickly to thank Mark for organizing a wonderful conference with a ridiculous lineup of people who have flown from Oslo and Pamplona and Istanbul and Frankfurt and Santiago and Madrid and London and so on to speak for a shorter amount of time than it would have taken for them to go through the security at any one of those airports. On what you've eloquently described as the single most important form of architectural production of the recent century. So, moving very quickly, it couldn't be better, I think, than to start with Tony, Vasif, and Thomas, just to say that if you don't know about the work of these people, then you surely are an idiot, and even more so for being in this room now. So 2 mistakes in one, but Tony Vidler, professor at Brown and Yale and Cooper at the same time, multitasking and transcending typical academic limits as he does in his own work, and a real friend personally and of the school and of the city and of the field. Wasif again, the director of the amazing SALT, Institution of SALT in Istanbul, literally one of the probably the most important cultural centers, not just in Istanbul but in the region, and Istanbul itself, of course, acting as the kind of acupuncture point and kind of gatherer of important ideas about the region, and literally sitting on the archives of the Ottoman Bank is this amazing institution forged by Wasif, starting off more or less in a kind of activist mode in a storefront, and now inside an enormous, literally in a bank, and becoming one of the most important sites for reflection. It's simultaneously a major institution, but also Wasif himself a very, very incisive intellectual. And I think any time a great institution is in the hands of an intellectual, we should drink, because it doesn't happen often. Thomas Keenan, likewise, the director of the Human Rights Project at Bard College, an astonishing person and writer, again a dear friend, but also a dear friend of architecture, because his work is, I think, dominated by an ongoing reflection on the nature of responsibility, even which was the subject even of some of the literal subject of his early work, but I think it continues to be. And of course, that general question, what does it mean to be responsible in architecture, can be only asked when talking with people like Tom and the Human Rights Project that he directs, which would allow us to see in which way architecture participates in this general question of responsibility. So ridiculous lineup of people, so I have to shut up right away so that you can listen to them, starting with Tony. And Tony, welcome back.
Smile. Just my records, thank you. Full disclosure, the statistics in this very brief talk are taken from that documentary, Remains, called Wikipedia. Can we have, how do I do that? Is there a way to do that? That one, okay, terrific. In a brief visit to a museum in Berlin last summer, I created an archive. It was a photographic archive and therefore digitally recorded and stored, somewhat precariously, in an archiving program that is surely sooner or later to become obsolete and without backward compatibility, which would of course ruin my archive. But that's only the end of a long story of an archive. For the archive I created was an archive of an archive. And this archive that I archived was itself only the ruins of a former archive that itself had been ruined and partially destroyed at least 8 times. And if we can trace this back to an original archive, we can find that even this had been reconstituted at least 3 times in its lifetime and partially ruined even as it grew into the archive we now know as the Archive of the Stasi, or Ministry of State Security of the GDR, built up between 1950 and 1989. This archive was assembled by some 274,000 people, 91,015 in full-time employment, including 2,000 fully employed unofficial collaborators, 13,073 soldiers, 2,232 officers of the GDR Army, together with 173 and 81 unofficial informants inside the GDR and 1,553 informants in West Germany, which added up to approximately 2.5% of East Germany's population between the ages of 18 and 60. Thus, the Stasi employed 1 full-time agent for every 166 East Germans, and the informer population counted 1 agent informer for 6.5 members of the general population. Although these are only the official numbers, because of the ruination of this archive several times, some estimate that the number of unofficial informers could be up to 500,000, but we will never know. The first archive was built up by William Zeisser, the first Ministry of State Security of the GDR, with Erich Mielke as his deputy. Zeisser was removed by Ulbricht after an attempted coup and replaced by Ernest Wollweber. Wollweber resigned in 1957 to be succeeded by his deputy, Erich Mielke, in 1957. In 1957, Marcus Wolf became head of the General Reconnaissance Administration, the foreign intelligence version of the Stasi. And each time that a new administration took over the archive, it was reconstituted, sometimes ruined and re-ruined, and then expanded. With the impending reunification and the fall of the wall, these are the hard workers of Stasi who've just received medals for their hard work. This is the operations room of the Stasi, with the beginnings of the kind of observation and surveillance system that we now know. These are the files of the Stasi. With the impending reunification and the fall of the wall, the Stasi began to shred its files. On one account, some 5 to 6% were destroyed, but only partially, because all the paper from the shredding was stored in over 16,000 bags that are now being meticulously reassembled by computers at the rate of 300 bags every 13 years. These are the bags. And this is a further ruination occurred in 1990 when the archive was occupied by citizens angry at the continued secrecy, smashing furniture, and of course, since many in the crowd were former Stasi officers and informers, many documents were destroyed, and many others recuperated and reinstated in another secret archive by CIA agents who took them to Langley, Virginia. That was what was left of some of the archive. And this is how they're being pieced together at the rate of 300 bags every 13 years. And that's the computer reconstitution, and that's how they're being pieced together. Following the reunification treaty, a makeshift museum was set up by a private group, and now this has been partly reconstituted as an almost official museum. I quote the official description. It's divided into 3 floors. The ground floor is being kept as it used to be. The decor is original with many statues and flags. Between the ground and first floor, surveillance technology and Stasi symbols are displayed, and on the top floor, which is the offices of the director, the reception room with a TV set, the cafeteria, and the office of Volpert, the lounge for drivers and bodyguards, and the office of Major General Hans Carlsson, director of the Secretariat, which we will see in a minute. Together with the cafeteria, the kitchen, the minister's workroom, the conference room, the cloakroom, and his bedroom. The original archive from which this museum is constituted, if I continue to use the term original, consisted of a number of heterogeneous objects. Files, of course, millions of them, you just see those, but also hundreds of technological artifacts. Cameras in all sizes, These are, of course, memorabilia of the heroism of the Stasi agents. This is actually Merkel visiting the museum a few years ago and hoping that her file wasn't there. And here are photographs which were taken for teaching purposes by the Stasi in order that their agents should recognize conspiratorial and suspicious behavior on the streets. On the bottom left, for example, you can see a suspicious group talking together, obviously the beginning of a conspiracy, and the person on the top right is obviously walking very suspiciously indeed. Cameras, of course, which of all sizes, clothing, from shirts with cameras in the collars to full suits with cameras all over. There were millions of photographs of informers, by informers, of informants, by informants, of informers, and all those who were informing. And all those shots taken by all those cameras. We can imagine there were many thousands of images of people's shoes taken for spy cameras inserted in the base of trash cans. The trash can is on the right. We can also imagine lots of people's hats taken from cameras inserted in bird baths, and of people's knees taken from hopefully inconspicuous logs placed at random in front of houses, as you see on the top left. And if you happen to be a gardener, you had to watch out there wasn't a camera in your watering can. And it goes all the way through, of course, to the thousands of pieces of cloth impregnated with the seat of people sitting down in order to get scent for tracking dogs. The official text says, during an interview, the seats were covered with a cotton cloth to collect the perspiration of the victim. The cloth was placed in a glass jar, which was annotated with the victim's name and archive. Other common ways this is the common way the scent will be collected, is through breaking into a home and taking parts of garments. The most common garment taken was underpants, because of how close the garment was to the skin. The Stasi would then use trained dogs to track down the person using this scent. There were all the objects seized from the suspect's home and businesses in this museum. There are also photographs used for teaching purposes, how to identify conspiracy. Also the day-to-day objects used by the Stasi officers, fake IBM typewriters and telephone consoles. That's the building in which it was. We'll see those in a minute. All the consoles, of course, were themselves tapped by Stasi officers tapping Stasi officers. This many-time ruined archive has now been reconstituted some 3 times already as a kind of museum of Stasi-land. This is the archive that I archived in the summer using a small digital Leica, the descendant of the many Leicas manufactured in all sizes in East Germany during the life of the GDR and used in this museum. Here display the relics of this enormous surveillance complex, the analog evidence of its extraordinary reach and often ridiculous technology. I photographed these objects in cases, in so doing recording myself and others in the reflections, traces that can now be used to assemble a dossier of my own movements last summer. This abyssally ruined archive is itself housed in a partially ruined headquarters of the Stasi, a huge complex of buildings now to be occupied by a group of happy alternative functions, healthy ones like community gyms, art galleries, and the like. But the central portion, which you see there, is more or less as it was. The office of its directors, the interrogation rooms, the cells, all furnished in mid-century modern. Here's the consoles, and there's an aerial photograph of the complex. Here we have one of the officers' desks. All furnished in mid-century modern with plants to match, as if we are entered into some version of a dwell ideal home. Buff-colored, plaid drapes, and even the cloth samples as we saw for the Stasi officers to select their seat covers in various browns and yellows. Indeed, in the director's apartment, where his overnight bed was still, let's see if we have that, made up, I felt strangely at home, as if in a newly opened boutique hotel, and ready to brush my teeth in his bowl and turn into sleep. Here then we realized that the true meaning of the new brutalism has come home to roost. Its raw concrete facades, its decorative grills, its polished stone floors. We just passed one with a trapdoor in it. That's not quite sure whether the trapdoor is to get rid of suspects or for interrogators to listen underneath the floor. All this then is an archive, and its ruination as well as its so-called restoration tells us an equally ruined story. As I left to download my own files, I wondered how we might now constitute a museum to, there's the major office of the director, his bed. I wondered how we might now constitute a museum to the new archival artifacts of digital surveillance, a Snowden museum, for example. But that would be in Moscow, where there actually exists a perfect copy, unruined, of the Stasi archive, filed carefully in the archive of the KGB, which regularly received carbon copies of the Stasi files, or at least those that the GGR felt able to communicate without too much collateral damage. Thank you.
Perfect. Do I have to press the button? Oh, good. Okay, basically I'm going to talk about a tiny project we did from last year. We completed last year the smallest possible project within 15 minutes. Basically, since 2010, we've been drudging along with research on 20th century Turkey on making and using space and conditions of production and how Turks settled into an urbanized alafranga West European or European habitat. What I mean by this is the introduction of the table, from floor to standing up, from sofa to chairs and tables and so on and so forth. And the evidence is scanty and the research has been completely unsatisfactory. It's a situation in which there was no industry other than a tiny set of minority carpentry shops churning out clunky, substandard Art Nouveau furniture copies. So this propelled us to look at kinds of stuff what I call handmade modernism, and for an expanded role for the architect and the sculptor. It was in fact either the architects or the sculptors who teamed up to make furniture, mostly one of a few kind. What you see is a cooperative building from Ankara, Yeşiltepe. So the research took us to very short-lived design shops in Ankara in the 1950s, and we came upon an apartment in a co-op, the owners which kept their furniture as is since the end of the 50s. And as the archive and research process allowed much more than we had expected, we did what we usually do, make the research manifest in some spatial form for a period. This is what we call a program that for most may be an exhibition. So how to make the program? Eames. So as we were thinking about the exhibition, I saw the truncated Eames house at LACMA, which was part of the Pacific Standard Time. And it was an annoying project indeed. It was real, as the living room was authentic. It was transported all the way to the pots to be flowered every second day, but it was also a forgery. It was sealed and pornographic in the wrong way around of looking at the house. We were not looking from inside out, or we were not perforating the house, but we were only looking from outside. It was over-specific in its minutiae, but much was left out, like bathrooms, like toilets, like bedroom, etc. The specificity of the preferred part served only to perpetuate the morbidity of the exhibition program. It was at the end of the day an exhibition piece, oversized decorated object that demonstrated the varied skills of a museum's entire workforce: shipping, photographing, measuring, dismantling, putting together, condition reports, and all that. I mean, obviously there's something about a dependency on the Hollywood condition here. This is clear. Like at the same time of this project, Chris Burden's Metropolis was being constructed with the same meticulous attitude, and and it would also refer to the whole material practice from Ed Keenhouse to Paul McCarthy, and also the 340-ton Heiser boulder was due to get on the road any day as this was on. So instead, we decided to look at another situation, and maybe the nemesis of Hollywood, to Lars von Trier's Dogville, as a kind of an austere reference. Repeating Trier's aesthetics was critical to thinking of the salon's sparse modesty. So the attempt was to reutilize alienation techniques of Brecht that Lars von Trier expounds on in Dogville. We simply wanted to break the illusion of a visitor developing into a spectator. So the program was a spatial and bodily experience. You see, you are seen in the exhibition. You also see yourself being seen in the exhibition. When nobody worries about cultural difference when the lights go out, when the lights go dim in a cinema, masturbation could be common to cinema or an experience, a cinematic experience, but nobody does it in a gallery unless you're Vita Conchi. And there's good reason for that. Eames House was a type that harked back to the ways of conventional design and architecture exhibitions. It was back to the World Fair for both method and motivation. That is to say, to promote what you have as the most significant thing ever. It closed off the promise of a project. The only thing it did not have was buttresses provided by the digital ease of today, blown up familiar photographic representations, blown up type, dizzying graphic performances on vinyl and technical surfaces. Salon is about objects and conditions. Furniture gives clues about the apartment. The apartment is a portent for the life around it, and that life helps weave a desire for a particular kind of cultural addiction or infatuation. Salon was performative, and it was a response to the status acquisition of museums and their tempting fair-like practices. Hence, it was not an exhibition. You could touch the furniture, sit on the chairs, but this was not foretold. As such, with the Brechtian trope, build your experience with unease. There was no navigation for the exhibition, no narrative. So performance replaced narrative causality. The program privileged gestures and postures over the concrete figure of the onlooker or the spectator. We peeled away the walls, which cannot be seen, makes the illusion obvious. Floor is traced, but you do not have to follow that trace. There was not a selection or a sampling of the lived extreme particularity of the house, so we peeled away the family photographs, all the personal stuff, flower pots and all of that. We also peeled away the paintings on the walls. This was only about furniture. So performativity became inevitable, and an enhanced exhibition condition would take over. What is the audience? A construct stipulated before he or she comes to the exhibition. The audience was always aware whether they were in the frame or not, supporting a project about the object and the conditions of the object. So we also decided to kind of completely differentiate the reading material and the activity of the performance. Now, exhibitions are typical orphan objects. It's a weak medium. It's never quite consumed. And it's in the late capitalist exhibition model, it's predicated upon this kind of divide between presence and contemporaneity, or to be present in the contemporaneity. Exhibitions' shelf lives are short. We are in ceaseless programming. they become obsolete before their time, and they become it becomes an increasingly experiential model looking upon this kind of historical example of Crystal Palace and onwards. So the question for me is, when is a project finished? You know, how do we consume a project? When do we actually finish? Do we finish it when we take it down and close the walls? Do we finish it when we finish the catalog? Do we finish it when the reviews come in 2 to 3 months and it's all over? How do we consume the project? Do we consume it as an object on the shop, in a shop, on the shelves? So what we do is we try to do something else at SALT. We constantly return to what we do. We return, we reissue, we serialize, we rethink, and we examine again. So Salon is, for example, a part of a project that's part of Modern Essays. That's a serialized project, which each, let's say, each program falls onto each other, and it will be lasting for a number of years. So it's not about kind of dedicating a particular space in the building for a particular project, that it would be the project space or this space or that space. It's not about that. And it's not about a medium-based exhibition practice. Sometimes it's a publication, sometimes it's a program, sometimes it's an exhibition, and we kind of refuse to let it die, because, I mean, as Wasiuta was saying, you know, we, as weak mediums, as weak media as exhibitions are, the response or the feedback to the exhibition coming through kind of the critical outside agency is no longer sufficient. It has to be produced and reproduced from the inside with critical engagement of an outside. But you cannot rely on press or criticism or professional criticism on that. That's no longer the time for it. So what we try to do is kind of work away from the ideological or market-driven narratives of certainties and cliches, and we try to look away from the main theme. We often do not take larger than life themes, and we try to integrate the research and the program into the archive and vice versa. And the idea that this, for example, this project did not come through as an exhibition project, it was never thought of an exhibition project. It became so because we found the stuff and then demanded it. And that's where we kind of arrested it in time during a program which was called an exhibition for a brief period of time. Thank you.
So I'm going to take the liberty of, with the permission of our organizer, of reading a text which is half written by somebody else. It's an email exchange that I recently conducted. I'm going to read you my email. An email exchange that I recently conducted with Hito Sterl about the question of the document. So I'll try to be honest and identify her parts which are better than mine. So. Hello, Hito. In Arles and Frankfurt over the last couple of years, you and I have been circling around a thicket of questions about the documentary, politics, evidence, forensics, and most especially modes of representing things that happen in the world. Reflecting on this, I found myself asking, what is a document anyway? So I turned to the dictionary. The word document in English comes from the Latin docere, to teach. And the earliest uses cited by the OED, which you're looking at here, associate it less with evidence than with instruction, and even warning, as in this usage from 1660, next to the last line there. Punishment goes to the prisoner, but examples to the document of all others. The event that is documented does not fully coincide with itself, or is doubled as an exemplum. It constitutes a trace which is pedagogically oriented towards the future. One needs to learn from it. So, punishment goes to the prisoner, the rest of us learn from what happened to the prisoner. It's not difficult to see how the meaning traveled from this notion of exemplary lesson to the contemporary sense of evidentiary proof. But they're not exactly the same. Rather than teaching us something, documentary today often seems to be designed to shut down deliberation, to impose the force of fact, and generate a decision or a judgment. When we say that something is evidence or proof, we generally aim to put an end to further questioning. But in fact, we can't. Evidence, even or especially in a legal context, does not close the case. Evidence, whether it's a written document, a testimony, or an object, opens the case. Something is presented for consideration, debate, dispute, interpretation, and for other interpretations. That is what happens to documents in trials and in political life. They are contested, their meanings explored and contrasted. Interpreters gather around them in disagreement because they have something to teach, but not always as unequivocally as the punishment was administered to the prisoner. I think that we too often forget this sense of the instructive instance when we talk about documentary and documentation today. The document still has something to teach us. What's interesting about this is the way it sidesteps the question of authenticity and truth. The document retains a tie to what happened by virtue of its specimen or exemplary status. It is ripped or doubled from what happens, but in order to teach, which means it's the lesson that somehow has primacy rather than the event. Hello, Tom. This is Hito. I guess the notion of document has traveled even farther in the past 2 decades. With contemporary technologies of dispersion and dissemination, a document is defined less by its content or its relation to reality than by its affective punch and velocity. When a picture of an atrocity spreads on Facebook, there are no fact checks, no evidentiary procedures whatsoever. But once launched, any kind of document, whether it actually even documents anything, can go on to create a new reality by means of the constituency that shared, spread, sustained, and built it. So within the last 25 years, we have experienced a massive shift from the document as evidence, replete with eternal anxiety over whether it is true or accurate or not, to the document as trigger and catalyst of events. Willem Flusser and Peter Weibel already remarked on this when they saw how Romanian protesters stormed television stations and started making history in '89. Any document is potentially a record, but equally it can be a creative force, regardless of what it actually shows. A huge number of so-called visual documents nowadays are pure abstraction. They don't show anything recognizable. Their rhetorical force is quantified by dispersion. Nowadays, it's less about people surrounding documents, but rather documents flying and swirling around people by way of social media. People decide whether to share and enforce their claims or not. In terms of its former function as evidence, this new usage is rather useless. Nevertheless, it changes the subject from a never-ending fixation on the document's truthfulness and all the convoluted and paranoid vocabulary surrounding it. But on the other hand, a document on its own, even if it provides perfect and irrefutable proof, doesn't mean anything. If there's no one willing to back the claim, prosecute the deed, or simply pay attention, there is no point to its existence. If evidence of human rights violations is only followed up when the U.S. Army takes an interest, and this is the Army taking an interest in Haiti, why bother? People realized this in the 1990s. Transparency or publicness didn't change a thing. So in a way, the new forms of the document are equally concerned with building constituencies around them, very often in the most wacky ways. But then again, this integrates politics into the foundations of documents themselves, instead of using them within pre-established legal, political, or journalistic scenarios, each with their own protocols for establishing the truth. Documents are fundamentally shape-shifting, taking on the form of metadata or algorithmic predictions, which again modifies their relation to reality in a dramatic way. My turn. Hi again. I share your weariness with the is it fake, was it photoshopped, is it staged neurosis, and the police forces of documentary security who want to protect us from the manifold deceits of the image. But it's no wonder that the anxiety persists. Documents may not have any verifiable relation to reality, may not show anything actual, or even, as you say, anything at all, but they still have to claim that they do. The document is a truth claim-making machine, an operational form, structured so that even if it's hollow, it can and will go on functioning. And since no document conveys its meaning unequivocally or speaks for itself, that is why a crowd, different crowds in different settings actually, gathers around it, arguing about what it means and trying to have it teach different lessons. This was an exemplary case of that, the Rodney King trial. There's something hollow, even if, since no document conveys its meaning unequivocally, there is something hollow about every one of them. That is why we can disagree about them, make claims for and with them, inscribe them in struggles, work with them to make things happen. Because an interpreter, a vector, is always required from before the start. But they also work on us. They are not simply inert, even if sometimes they do not put up a lot of resistance to their use and abuse. It would be wrong to think about them as instruments and tools, though they do things to us, whether at the level of individual affect or in the networks they create by linking us to other realities, other images, other interpreters. You are right that they don't always work, and that the 90s taught us this, 3.5 years of the war in Sarajevo live on TV. But we can't blame the images for what happened. What we can blame, besides all the obvious political and military decisions, is the notion that the images do our work for us, that because they were evidence, they were also triggers for actions that would put an end to the slaughter they showed. There, the notion of documentary proof really is culpable. The idea that in the document itself there is not only truth or fact, but also a force that compels a response. Waiting around for the document to be attended to properly doesn't seem like much of a strategy anymore. I think your notion of a new form that integrates politics into the foundations of documents themselves is exactly right, and it's happening all around us. Think of the Facebook campaign by the civil resistance in Kafr Nabil in Syria, the reverse engineering of surveillance and tracking data by the forensic oceanography and Watch the Med projects, the drone strike visualizations done for the UN by the forensic architecture team at Goldsmiths, and I'm just going to show you those images now, or the advocacy strategy that accompanied Amy Ziering and Tracy Dick's film, The Invisible War, about rape within the US military. All examples of situations in which the production of image-based evidence is incorporated into a political project. When we admit that the document can't speak for itself, we can start to map out new routes it can take, new networks it can catalyze, new claims it can provoke, and new politics to help bring those claims into being. Hi, Tom. In many cases, actually most, we do not even reach the point where anyone could argue about the truth claims of a document, because most documents are not entering any arena where such assessments could be made. Most documents never become evidence of anything in an institutional sense. The ones that do are already a privileged minority. Most documents share the fate of most images and remain unseen because there is a massive oversaturation of visual material. They are the dark matter of the visual world, the stuff that actually causes it to expand and disintegrate at a speed that hasn't yet been properly understood. In this situation, paradoxically and even shockingly, it could be more productive to facilitate a place of public debate, on or offline, where people can share and debate about the images and data they are producing, rather than insist on a document's truth in certain forums. Images are not a matter for specialists anymore. Anyone can produce them in great numbers. So in a way, concerns have shifted from interpreting documents according to predetermined protocols to making and disseminating them. At this moment, one may even have to start a major push to erase most documents that are being created via algorithms and metadata of people's behaviors and habits and claim the right for people to go undocumented, off the grid, and to retain some control over when to be documented or not. But this is just a temporary situation created by a huge imbalance between an overwhelming lack of justice and equality and an almost unprecedented ability for people to create documentary records. The map, so to speak, is far exceeding the territory. It's about rethinking what and how much needs to be documented. Hi, Hito. I'm not sure I understand your distinction between facilitating a place of public debate and insisting on some documents' truth in certain forums. Do you mean that we shouldn't be content with or limit ourselves to existing forums, especially international, legal, and media ones, but try to bring new ones into existence in order for the irrelevant documents to have a chance? If so, I'm with you, because it's certainly the case that the existing forums are extremely restricted in terms of what sorts of documents cross their threshold and why, and in terms of the interpretive protocols they allow. The important battle is at the thresholds, I think, maybe even more than the interpretive battles within them. But isn't that what we've been talking about? How new sorts of documents, from jihadi martyrdom videos to viral human rights campaigns, produced by otherwise unheard of persons and forces and circulated in unprecedented ways, can themselves start to force new forums into existence, can spark new debates, and not only put new questions on the agenda, but change the way the agenda is constructed. As for oversaturation, I'm not so sure. Or rather, haven't we always been oversaturated and moving too slowly to catch up with everything? There are always too many words and too many images and too many sounds to be able to figure out what's going on. Which is to say, things are always getting lost, overlooked, forgotten. If there weren't this combination of too much and not enough, if somehow there was just enough, just the right amount, and we could make sense of it all, then we'd have no need for politics, conflict, interpretation, dispute, documents. Hi, Tom. It's interesting how much mobile technology has changed the stakes. Before, one could either watch events or participate in them, as Flusser argued. The revolution would not be televised, because if people watched it in their living rooms, there'd be no revolution. Now, documenting has become more of a live activity and less about the retroactive interpretation of objects. It is the making, live streaming, editing, encoding, encrypting, dissemination, and mediation, not only of the documents themselves, but equally and maybe more importantly of the events being documented. The event is being made across different platforms and networks as a stack of actions, images, and feedback loops, traveling from cloud to cobblestone. Sometimes this looks rather funny. In some contemporary riots, there are 5 masked people with a tablet device for every protester without one. The street starts to look like a mix between an electronics fair and an old master's painting gallery, with hundreds of glowing tablets held up high above heads. Tablets have replaced flags or protest signs. Actually, it's a very clear expression of what people are doing. They reframe and re-edit reality in real time out in the streets. Of course, there's a lot of silliness and danger with that, including the obvious fact that each person thus becomes perfectly trackable. But ninja media worldwide will learn how to deal with that and become schools or labs to negotiate the confusing realities of image events. Hi, Hito. People want to make a record of what's happening, but they also want to do something with it. Tell a story, make a claim, send it and show it to others, let it loose. In the lab school of the streets, you're right. They are our researchers and our instructors. They are making documents in that old sense of instruction with which we began this conversation. They are also making evidence, not in the sense of proof, but rather in the more forensic sense of making something evident, presenting it to a public, calling for a judgment. Sometimes in that fleeting, Snapchatty DIY way you describe, other times in proper labs with high-res imagery, GIS, and 3D animations. But in both cases, the question is less the old one about the correspondence between image and event, and more about something different. How to face the fact that the events are made with and out of and into images and other documents as well, and that it's up to us to respond to them. Thank you.
internal and half of which sort of external. But I mean, I don't have a deep, meaningful question because I think the papers were too good to
be true.
to be true. But there was almost there was almost an aesthetic resonance between the papers, which had to do with a kind of sense of repetition, of seriality, of overdetermination. So the endless rebuilding of the Stasi archive, the sort of serializing strategy of SALT and the kind of industrial production of documents in real time in the streets and so on. So I guess just a sort of a comment about the relationship between sort of documents and repetition. A repetition to the nth degree. Tony, do you want to?
Well, repetition, yes. Well, actually, my interest in the history of the Stasi archive is obviously very pertinent in a way in relationship to our question of, how do you archive contemporary surveillance archive? But it was actually came out of the exhibition I did on Jim Sterling, where I had to go through Jim Sterling archive, right? Now, Jim Sterling archive was simply, it's called an archive, but it's simply every piece of paper that was in his office since 1974, and not much before that. And you search through it in order to find out all kinds of evidence, documents that led you to believe that it was this order in which he had developed a particular plan or whatever. And what became so evident in looking at these documents, and that's really happy that Tom started to talk about the fungibility of the document and evidence, was that that any order that you put the pieces of paper in could be true, right? And in fact, what had been destroyed or thrown away by Jim, if it had been there, the typical art historian would say, well, we need that evidence in order to build the case. But my conclusion was that we could have done away with half of the archive and still got a result that approximated to sort of the way in which he worked. But in the end, it wasn't quote unquote the way in which he worked. It was the way we projected onto these bits of paper how we might think. And I think when people have I've been talked to people who've opened their own files in the Stasi archive, and then it's also the same question: is what does it mean that they were tracked backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards to the butcher or to the baker or whatever? And it seemed to me that the Stasi archive actually, in its continual attempt to be the faithful reproduction of everyday life of suspect peoples, i.e. everybody's suspect, was such a Herculean task of like sort of rolling up the stone up the hill and it rolling down again.
Right. I mean, I can't help but ask the question whether there's any significant difference between what you do in the Stasi, there's the slip, in the Sterling archive, and what they were doing, in the Stasi archive. Or to put it another way, in as much as you're a scholar, do you treat Sterling as a criminal?
I certainly treat myself
and
as
you, as it were, monitoring his.
I'm certainly
as
a
detective.
Yeah, whether he's a criminal or not is up to the objective vision of the observer of what I produce as a documentary evidence. Right.
So I mean, obviously we get back to that, but there must be some. There is.
But it's always there's always a suspicion that you're not getting the real picture.
Right.
And so as long as you know you're not getting the real picture, it becomes a kind of cat and mouse game with yourself in terms of the various hypotheses that you could draw from like 5 pieces of paper.
Right. It seemed to me, Vasif, with that incredible project, it seems to me, the counterexample of the morbidity of the spectacle of a kind of amputated piece of the Eames house versus what you did. My curiosity was that it was multiple, but it had something to do with the fact that the apartment you chose kept all the original furniture more or less the same. So sort of two questions. Whether the people who were living in the apartment felt themselves to be maintaining an archive or even an exhibition, and did so, as it were, so faithfully that you were extraordinarily careful with that, how you then, as it were, interpreted that and redisplayed it, and trying not to do the Eames thing. I mean, just that sort of somehow that sense of again your relationship to the documents that you were moving from one place to another. Again, as consistent with the Stasi thing, that also seems to me there is implied here that archives move. There's movement in archives, like essential to their quality as an archive. I guess the simple beginning of that question is, why did they keep the furniture?
Well, I mean, regarding the intentionality is this particular co-op building, and the people who were living in it come from what may call a zero generation of the Republic. That is, they completely formed and shaped to the nth degree by the Republican ideology, and their relationship. And we're talking about, of course, the at the end of the 50s and early 60s, which is a very particular kind of a very blissful, joyful, hopeful period before 68, before the great disillusionment about everything else. And so the acquisition that they were doing, not physically, I'm not talking about the physical acquisition, was these objects were very precisely dear to them in the project of modernity, in their local modernity, in their description of modernity, and they didn't touch it afterwards. It just remained like that. The father, the man, passed away, and the lady of the house moved out and kept the house as is. You know, every other month going and cleaning and so on and so forth. But it was fundamentally, it was there. That was a witness to a particular moment in time, and it had to stay that way.
It was a museum of her life.
Almost. Yeah. So what we did is we took that and brought it back again. Yeah.
But you did the reverse of the Stasi in the sense that you removed all identifying. You took away the identification, the social security numbers, family photographs, like it.
Which brings me back to your question: are you a detective?
Yeah.
But you're a curator, right? But what is interesting about curatorship is there is no verb to curate. It doesn't exist in the language because it's an object. Curare is to cure, and therefore you're a curate. You actually are the witness for the prosecution and the curing of souls, right? So that you actually are a religious personality who has to take a position in relationship to the evidence, as well as a detective finding out what the evidence gives you as a position.
Right. So you could be on the prosecution or the defense, but not. You cannot be, as it were, neither. Yeah. And Tom, it's like listening. It's like when you watch a movie and you're watching one film and there's the soundtrack from another film. It did appear that all three talks were the same to me. So did you feel a kinship with what had come before?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, especially in this sense of perhaps along the thematic of ruins. I think all the whole problem of evidence, as I'm looking at it, is a problem of ruins, traces of things which aren't there anymore. And I think Tony's notion of the repeated ruination and Vasif's sense, it sounded to me like you were describing a kind of a tomb or something, or a mausoleum of a former life that no one lived in anymore. That it feels to me there's a very strong tie to a really original notion of what the evidence is of. The evidence is only interesting and valuable because the thing that it's evidence of isn't there anymore. So that what you have to work with is the trace or the document, not the object. So in that sense, all of these things are sort of like dinosaurs in a way. They're no one has ever seen them with their own eyes, but we have all kinds of evidence that they were around.
I mean, it seems to me that one of the multiple threads, it seems, between the three papers, although I hate people that are doing what I'm now doing, which is to produce a sort of synthetic, but in common was the destruction of the wall. In Wasif's case, the political decision not to allow people to walk across the wall. In the case of the main example you were showing of the missile, the actual destruction of the wall, and so in a way the architects reconstructing what the wall is that has been damaged, measurement of the shadows and so on. And in Tony's case, the violation of the walls, both in the sense of the occupation of the reoccupation of the archive, but also in the technologies that you showed, which allowed viewpoints to be from the inside of objects and so on. So again, the multiplicity of viewpoints that
continuously hacking process that beats the firewall.
Right. So inasmuch as walls sometimes understood to be precondition of an archive that has to be somewhere, in this case, our archive is constituted precisely through a kind of erasure of walls, which creates optics that didn't exist before, multiple optics. In the case of Tom's argument, an abundance of micro cameras and macro cameras, like long distance views combined with handheld views. It's also there in the Stasi.
Right.
View from the other side of the street versus view from the watering can, or your own underpants testifying against you, which seems to me particularly sadistic and some even sort of impressive move. But is there possibility some thoughts around the it would be something like the violation of the archive as being part of its as part of its function, as distinct from the rebuilt the how many times did the Stasi archive get rebuilt? Eight. So this sort of instability of the archive as actually part of the archival mechanism, as it were.
Right. And of course, the archive is the house of the archon, and the archon is he who is nominated by the polis to keep the laws and records of the polis in his house, right? But as soon as the democracy votes another group of rulers for the polis, the archon has to either leave his house and give it to the next archon, and you never know whether the records are destroyed, and you never know. But there's that transfer of knowledge, which is always unstable, right?
So the two related thoughts there. One is the mobility of the document,
right?
But also an actual violation of. There's an implied violation that you have to break the wall. I mean, it's always domestic. It's the beginning of a question, Tom.
It's always a home.
Right. So in Tom's argument, his email exchange, the document could be leaning towards evidence or instruction, and its ability to flicker. In the end, you seem to be saying it between the two of you, it was a flickering between these things. It was both producing evidence, as it were, trying to narrow things down, but it was also opening up. You used the word creative, I think, at the end.
It's interesting that in the Stasi sense, when they were trying to move psychologically to terrorize people as opposed to real torture, they used the German word for decomposition. And so you decompose someone's psyche in the same way as you're beginning to try to compose all that series of psyches into an archive.
So, I mean, having rendered everything so clear, we now open it up to the audience. We will keep going if you don't join in. Yeah.
I'd like to get back to the question of exhibition and materialization. I very much liked the sort of interplay between Tony's and Tom's papers, because what Tom really did is to move away from the notion of the archive, which has, of course, traditionally the notion of stability that we now all question, and asked for us to respond more directly and concretely to documents, wherever they are. Now, my question is whether this kind of musealization of the Stasi materials in Berlin, whether that isn't precisely, that is an archive now that comes with a certain pretense of stability, but it really closes things down. And that's the question for Tony. Does it do that? I mean, it presents something as finished, as musealized, and rather than as the Stasi materials were functioning in the 1990s, where people still went in and looked at their documents, and there was a lot of political debate about these kinds of. In other words, the direct response to the documents involving individuals who went into the archive and had access was key at that point. And that dimension, it seems to me, gets lost when then the archive itself gets musealized. So there's a question of the relationship between museum and archive that I'm raising.
Until, the next PhD student goes in there and finds that nothing that was thought to be so in relationship to the cursory reading of, 20 files was so in relationship to 500 files or 2,000 files, or as soon as the person who goes, the individual who finds their file now has, as the movie had it, their life completely transformed and overturned. So I think the museum is a complete intermediary in between the viewer, the observer, my collection of photographs, which I do things with which the archive certainly, which the museum certainly doesn't want me to do. I think it's continuously in flux. I think it's only a hypothetical stability that's there in terms of the social use of the archive.
But the archive is still open? I mean, people do go in, so underneath the museum there's a functioning collection of documents?
Yes, the files are there. And you can apply to see your file. You can't apply to see anybody else's file, right? But historians like Timothy Garton Ash have seen more than their file, although his file was particularly amusing to him, I think.
But just to try to repeat Andreas' question for Tom, so it seems to me it also applies to the instability of these documents, which in the email exchange don't necessarily have to have neither need to have a relationship to the so-called truth or reality, but nor are they simply, as it were, fictions. Nor, if I understood the argument correctly, nor do they actually even have to be seen. Like they operate as a kind of swarm.
Yeah, I mean that's Hito's argument is that the velocity or the mobility of the call it new media document is its primary characteristic, not its content or its its relation referentially to anything else. And I think that's right, but I think what's more complicated about it is that it's not just velocity. There remains some kind of what I called being ripped from what happened. There remains some sort of tie, which is an implicit claim in any document, no matter how fast it's moving and no matter who sees or doesn't see it.
And
so
once it's stabilized as an image, though, then a whole interpretive process comes along about the series of images, about what they represent and what's not in the image, and what's outside the sphere of the image, which is the photographic interpretation, which is also unstable.
Absolutely, so Rodney King is case in point, number one there.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, just staying with Andre's argument, the rebuilding of one of those documents, which so much resembled the reconstruction of a work of art, by sort of scholarly reassembling the fragments of a Greek statue to form an original document. An extreme version of, or an exaggeration of what you said would be that in the same way that to protect a book is for it to be read, not for it to be behind closed doors, to, as it were, protect an archive or to allow an archive to work, it requires the violation of any sense of stability around the archive itself. So the rebuilding of the document is maybe the more insidious dimension of is the more of the museum effect there than in, let's say, a room in which you see tape recorders and stuff like that. It's the constitution of the documents as archival works of art to be protected that stops the conversation.
And what's left out, because what's left out of the Eames house, as you pointed out, is precisely that which made the Eames house a house. and a living operation, whereas where you get the reconstitution of the shredded documents, what I'm interested in is they can't reconstitute the whole of any single document out of any of those bags. But God knows what it's going to do to people's lives when they come and read their file and they find it's been interpolated by somebody else's file because the computer actually brought together, because it's all the same typewriter.
Right. Which could be something like what would have happened if Jim Sterling walked into your exhibition of him.
Exactly. He would have walked out
Nicholas.
immediately.
Yeah, I'm having a question probably to all of you. How would you define the relation between the archive and the exhibition? Because to me it seems that these are two different conditions where we all know there are archive exhibitions, but I think they also point at different ways of perceptions, ways of agency also. If we take, for instance, the example of the Stasi archive, there's a museum and there's an archive, and within the archive there are very different audiences. There are files that only victims are allowed to see and not the general public or not the perpetrators. So it's an incredibly complex system. So I wonder, what are the audiences of these conditions, whether it's an archive or an exhibition? And to me, I think there is maybe also a question of agency here, because I think in Tom's examples, there's clearly a reference to the production of evidence that has a political and juridical meaning.
Mm-hmm. So maybe I could direct that to Vasif, because Vasif, you are the person who did raise the question of who is the audience.
This question doesn't occur to me as something to worry about or to think about, actually. And fundamentally, I don't know what I don't know what you mean by archive, actually. Do you mean a heap? Or what first? Yeah. Yeah, but yes. In which condition, though? In which condition of the Stasi archive? After being shredded? Or which condition of the Securitate archive which pretty much doesn't exist? Right. So I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't start with that question in mind. Actually, it doesn't ever occur to me. And practically with this particular in this particular project, it was a stopover over a journey of things. At one moment that was done, and it did not have a reference to an archive, because we were not working with an archival condition anyhow, and that's it. So if you'd explain a bit more why you need to make that distinction, or why we need that distinction.
Probably I can't explain it properly, but maybe it has to do with the conversation between Hito and Tom, because I witnessed some of previous discussions between them, and I think there was, because we did an exhibition together at Porticos in Frankfurt with Tom and Eyal Weizmann and Hito Steil, and I think there was some kind of a tension between two parts of the exhibition. Of course, you're totally right, Vasif, that for me it was one exhibition, and it didn't make any difference whatsoever between the different parts. But still, I think there was, in Eyal's and Tom's part, there was more an idea of agency related to a political question and a juridical question linked to The Hague and other locations in a way. And I think for Hito, that was more within the logics that you described in your conversation here.
I didn't read it that way. So the porticus in this exhibition was divided between an upstairs and a downstairs, and Hito used some very complicated 3D scanning equipment to reconstruct the scene of a crime in Bosnia in 1993. Now it didn't, and upstairs Eyal and I showed some pieces from this forensics research that we've been working on that began with a investigation of the history of forensic anthropology and so on. But it included some other things that were related to juridical venues. But I took Hito's project there as maybe not a formal address to a tribunal of some sort, but a demand or an attempt to register the injustice of the fact that there hadn't been an address to a formal tribunal in relation to this crime. So what she did was, it wasn't what she produced, not exactly evidence, but she produced sort of like a simulacrum of what would have been evidence had there been a trial in which evidence could have been introduced. And it was certainly fancier or more highly articulated and higher resolution than most evidence that's presented to these sorts of tribunals is. So it had a sort of shaming quality to it as well. But I took the two, I mean, now I'm going to play Mark's game and tell you that the things that are seemingly different are exactly the same. But it felt to me like there was a very strong coincidence between those two, maybe in spite of the curatorial intention.
But in a certain way, that brings us back to what the discussion at the beginning, which is the legal structure which is hovering behind the whole enterprise of Exhibit A,
Yep.
the prosecution, the curate,
Yeah.
who has an ideological or religious or a legal framework in which to deliver the evidence, and the archive, which I took from the Stasi point of view, I took the archive to be, it's this relentless, Benjamin says a lot about it, it's this relentless will of a bureaucracy to assemble evidence against itself, absolutely meticulously, under the understanding that it would never ever be not secret, right? I mean, if you look at the archives of some of the bureaucracies of the Holocaust, for example, I mean, the evidence that was collected, which is painstakingly typed out of numbers of victims, numbers of train cars, numbers of this, numbers of that. I mean, and the Stasi kept, out of its own kind of pleasure principle, all these objects of surveillance, together with all the results of the objects of surveillance, together with all the presumably all the legal trials that then came after the suspects were arrested for treason or crimes against the state. So in that sense, the exhibit is always prosecutorial, right. And it's always forensic. An archaeological exhibit. We're always saying the evidence says that the Bronze Age peoples gathered around the fire and beat their tools out of bronze, and the evidence says that, right? Because we've had forensic, digging into this operation.
So I mean, it could be that we think of the panels to come as attempting to answer your question, but the beginning of the answer seems to me sounds something like that the concept of archive and the concept of exhibition can never be separated, but nothing in that intertwining of those two words is obvious. So hypothetically, for example, if all of the documents of an archive are digitized and available online, it's not clear that the word archive works anymore. So in a way, the word archive is signaling a lack of exhibition, but following your own lead, it's more like a restriction of who can see. So it's a restriction of the audience. The word archive itself already produces an image of that which you are not allowed to see. Which is typically the image of the wall, of the container, of the outside. Because almost everything that Tom was describing in terms of the ecology of images today makes that ever more complex. Just to take a pathetic example, I think the Rodney King video was taken through the windows of a domestic house, so it was if Wasif's analysis begins with a kind of distant photograph of a 1955 apartment building, and then he zooms in and locates the key apartment, but strips the apartment of evidence of any evidence of a personal crime, but pulls away the furniture itself. The Rodney King thing went exactly the other way around, that from inside somebody's apartment I think we never saw, we saw the view from that apartment, which was staged in the most public possible way. So I think in the moment in which the status of the wall is radically destabilized, which is very much the world we live in today, those words, archive and exhibition, dance in slightly different ways. But I think you could indicate that was always the case. If you think back, an archive, again, just a brutal way to end the session, but if Stasi was attempting a total work of art and were well on the way, since they had 1 to 6.5%, so basically the image that they were producing was going to be as big as the thing that it was of.
Right.
And if we now live in that world, in which, as Tom was pointing out, the image of the world we live in may even be bigger than the world we live in.
Territory.
So if the map exceeds the territory, use this expression, or your partner used the expression, that the black hole of images, then in a way the total work of art has. I mean, there's a stage after the total work of art, which is when the work of art exceeds the dimension of the known world
and implodes.
In that moment, what do the words archive and exhibition mean? And I think we don't have the answer to that, but I think that very much it's in Mark's formulation of the conference for us to think about that. So I can say that if the people that come after are as good as the first three, we may be able to offer you a slightly better answer by the end of the day. Anyway, I think we're just going to start the next panel immediately because we're on a clock.
Thank you. I'd like to be off now.